You mentioned kindly that I'm an expert on China. I'm only an expert on China in the sense that any journalist is an expert on anything. I've been there. Last time I was there, I went to the Shanghai Poster Museum, which I recommend very highly to anybody who happens to be in Shanghai. And I was somewhat alarmed, actually, when I saw on the program earlier that we were going to have poster presentations from the students, because it reminded me of being in the Shanghai Poster Museum and reading the big character posters from the Cultural Revolution. And I'll quote from one on the walls of the Beijing No. 2 Middle School in 1966. The floodwaters of the great proletarian Cultural Revolution are now pounding the various positions of the bourgeoisie. The hotbeds of capitalism are no longer safe. Ducktail haircuts, spiraling hairdos and other queer hairstyles, cowboy jeans, tight-fitting shirts and blouses, various kinds of Hong Kong-style skirts and dresses, and obnoxious photographs and journals are now under heavy fire. We must block all channels leading to capitalism. We want to smash all the hotbeds that breed revisionism, and we are not going to be soft on all these things. And indeed, in Beijing Middle School No. 6, among the various atrocities that took place, they beat the teachers and painted slogans in their blood on the walls of the school. Now, I've actually been to Beijing Middle School number 2, and I can tell you it's not like that these days. One is confronted by a set of extremely bright, extremely ambitious, extremely fluent in English young people who one can expect to go and study at Western institutions and become part of the Chinese official elite. Of course, the Cultural Revolution led on to, you could see it as being part of Mao's effort to regain power, which had been drifting away from him, which culminated in his death in 1976, the deposition of the Gang of Four, and then ultimately a set of economic reforms leading to Deng Xiaoping's Southern Tour in 1992. In 1989, I first visited China in 1992. I went to Shanghai. We were taken on there was very little of the modern day Shanghai there. There was the old Bund. We were taken on a bus tour of the south side of the river, and we were told that they were going to build a set of skyscrapers in a new financial district, a set of holes in the ground, and we all said, well, we'll wait and see if that happens. Of course, anybody who goes to Shanghai now will know that it did indeed happen, and I've learned to take what the Chinese say about what they're going to do pretty seriously. The time before I visited China, I went to the Beijing Party School, was invited there for a seminar, and it reinforced the impression that I think anybody in this room will have of the Chinese party apparatchik as a set of very impressive, highly educated, extremely experienced, technocratic, the British term is mandarins, and I think it's more than a coincidence that the UK civil service modelled itself on Chinese bureaucrats as an example to look up to. The impression one has, of course, talking to that group of people, is that they're extremely thoughtful, they're deeply interested in economics, they're deeply interested in economic reform, they're essentially pragmatic in lots of ways about the way in which the development of the country can develop. And indeed, one can look at the achievements of China in the past 20 or 30 years, 600 million people out of poverty, and the way in which it's really fundamentally changed in many ways as a country. And so I would say that's the impressive side of the internal economic machinery of China. And I think that until really quite recently, that's the way anybody would have seen the Chinese elite as really, in some ways, enviable. pragmatic, not stuck in the same political crises and stasis of some Western countries. Now, more recently, we've been reading in the Western press, if not in the Chinese press, much more about the levels of corruption at high levels in the party. There are serious questions about billions being squirreled away by members of the high elite, including members of the Standing Committee. Clearly, Xi Jinping's new administration is very concerned about that and is engaged in a pretty serious crackdown, going to relatively high levels in trying to damp that down. That, I suppose, that's looking at China from an economic perspective domestically. I was looking at a presentation the other day of China's trade flows around the world internationally, and the presentation pointed out that it was extremely similar in terms of size and breadth of trade flows with the British Empire in the late 19th century. And while I'm recommending museums, I would also recommend the Opium War Museum in Dongguan, I think it is. It's on the banks of the Pearl River, near the Humen Bridge. And they still have the gun emplacements where the Chinese fired on the British as they sailed up the Pearl River to claim territory, which ended up with the British being given Hong Kong, or insisting on being given Hong Kong. My father was born in India. My mother was born in Uganda. My paternal grandfather was in the Indian Army. My maternal grandfather was a surveyor in Uganda. I'm a child in some ways of the empire, so it's rather hard to turn to China and say, you're building an international trade empire, you really shouldn't do that. But clearly, one of the interesting things, I think, if you compare the British Empire of the late 19th century with the present-day Chinese trade flows and its economic influence in the world, is how relatively invisible China is compared with the British Empire. I think the British made very little secret that they were in charge and wanted to be in charge. The Chinese, much less so, deliberately. And in a sense, they've almost sort of white-labelled themselves around the world. If you go to some of what we now know as the Mint countries, Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and the B of the BRICS, Brazil, you will see, obviously, the enormous influence of the trade flows and the sucking in of demand from China, and how that's affecting countries all around the world and not in the traditional G8 countries, less so. I'm going to make this work. China makes it absolutely clear it wants to remain low-key. It's deeply uncomfortable with being seen as an aggressive power, both diplomatically and economically. I think one of the enigmas of China's modern economic influence and growing economic influence, not just in terms of the size of the economy, but its interdependence with other countries, is that what happens is it becomes more visible internationally. What happens is it can't keep a low profile. And we've seen various flashpoints with that, and particularly between the US and China with the blocking of the potential Sinuk bid, the Huawei being blocked from the US on security grounds. It's an interesting contrast with Japan, which despite the tensions over the years, and probably tensions of, say, 30 years ago, in terms of whether or not the Japanese were taking over the US, buying the Rockefeller Center and so forth, Japan has managed to maintain a relatively good economic relationship with these trading partners. And I think one of the questions I think for China as it goes forward is it's going to have to stand up, it's going to have to become more visible, and will it do as good a job as Japan as being seen not only diplomatically as not a threat, but economically as not a threat?